Thank you very much for attending. If you can kind of come in and find your seats, then we can kind of squeeze together here. We've got a great crowd this evening. Thank you so much for coming. We're talking tonight about, is there a religious comeback? My name's Dr. Chad Pecknold. I teach in the School of Theology here, and I'm also a scholar of the IHE, and it's my privilege to be here tonight representing IHE and the university. IHE, as you all know, is one of the nation's leading institutes committed to identifying the conditions for eudaimonia, human flourishing, happiness, from an interdisciplinary perspective, coming at questions from a wide range of angles, bringing scholars from across the university, across the country, the world, right here to Catholic University in Washington, D.C., to think about questions that pertain to us all. At the outset, I'd like to also extend our thanks and gratitude to the Catholic Information Center down here. Raise your hand if you're with the CIC here, over here. Thank you so much for being here, co-sponsoring this event with us. You're a very great partner for us here. I want to thank the excellent IHE staff, especially Russell Hittinger, our executive director, Stephen Higgins, our managing director, and the whole team. A lot of people work to pull these events off, and so thank you to all of them. One of our longest partnerships, and I think I was there for the beginning of it, was
a shadowy restaurant in New Haven, Connecticut.
Yes, that's right. A shadowy restaurant in New Haven, Connecticut, in which myself and Joe Capizzi went up to recruit the great Ross Douthat to the IHE and our first media fellow with the IHE. Of course, Ross needs no introduction as a opinion columnist of longstanding at the New York Times and a great friend to Catholic University. We've enjoyed this friendship and this collaboration for many years, and Ross himself has been a leader of our discussions on many occasions, and we're very grateful to him for that on all sorts of issues of the family, domestic culture, international relations, and whatnot. So thank you very much, Ross, for your good relationship to the IHE as a media fellow. Spencer Klavan also needs no introduction, but he is the associate editor of Claremont Review of Books, and he has a new book also that we're going to be discussing tonight. I'll say just a word about each book before we begin. Each book, both Ross's book and Spencer's book, examine our own spiritual landscape today and ask these questions about what is the human longing for society, for the promise of religious faith coming back? President Trump today, the National Prayer Breakfast, said, we're going to bring God back. And that, I think, for one thing, God's never left. And God is with us tonight. And so we might just say a quick prayer in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. For all of you who are not Catholics, this is how we welcome you and train you. And these two books, one by Ross Douthat, Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious. He means Christian. And Spencer Klavan, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. And these are great books. They are over at that CIC table, and boy, do we have a deal for you tonight. If you buy both books, half off. Right? Good deal. So go and buy afterwards, half off, and stick around. We'll have refreshments for a reception afterwards there. We can all talk to each other and have a good discussion. So with no further ado, I'm going to come join them and we'll have a conversation. Ross.
Dr. Pecknold.
let's talk about not a religious comeback, but our present moment. We have people arguing or have argued for Christian nationalism, integralism, a Christian revival. We have now today announced that we have a White House Office of Faith. Contextualized,
Headed by
Pastor Paula White.
That's right. Yes.
Taking us all the way back to Norman Vincent Peale on some level, prosperity. Situate your book in this context in which religious revival is in the air, and you might even say Christian revival is in the air. You situate your book in light of that context.
Sure. So I think, and Spencer can obviously speak for himself, but I think we're both in different ways writing into a moment which I wouldn't say it's a moment of revival. It's a moment of interest in the possibility of revival, maybe is the right way to put it, right? And there's sort of various ways you can kind of take the temperature of a moment. You can do a kind of big picture story and say, look, for the last 25 years in American life, the big religious story has been disaffiliation, right? The rise of the so-called nuns, the bad kind, not the good kind. People with no religious affiliation. And that trend has basically been sort of the backdrop of so many different cultural controversies over the last generation. And in the last few years, it seems at the very least to have kind of hit a ceiling, maybe gone slightly into reverse. So again, not a revival, but at the very least, the end of a kind of period of secularization, right? You have, a certain kind of apparent generational turnover where you had, this is much more anecdotal, but you have, in Gen Z, seemingly a somewhat different attitude toward religion and faith than in preceding generations. I was looking at data that someone was circulating for Great Britain the other day, where it was clear that the baby boom generation in Great Britain, the US is a little different, but in Great Britain was much more sort of explicitly secular in its identification than Generation Z. And then you have a kind of backdrop, a kind of cultural backdrop where the crudest way to put it is a version of the 1970s has come back, right? Where there's just a lot of somewhat unfocused, non-doctrinal spiritual interest that is not just a kind of generic sort of woo level, let's be one with the universe. It's more concrete than that. It still has a sort of ironic distance from some of its own practices, but it is trying in various ways, I would say, to sort of get in touch with what you might call secondary powers, beings and forces that are not the creator God of the universe, but are somewhere in between the divine and us. And I think you can tell this story about the interest in psychedelics and those kind of experiences. You can tell, obviously, a version of this story about interest in witchcraft and tarot and astrology and neo-paganism. You can tell a version of that story about UFO fascinations, and I think you can even fold in AI. And we've done an event here that probably some of you attended, talking about sort of post-Christian spiritualities, where we talked about exorcism and the microphone stopped working. Hopefully that won't happen tonight. So that's spirits of the air, right, and the vasty deep. So that is, I think, sort of the context that we're both writing into, but also part of that context is in the intelligentsia, there are both some sort of specific high-profile or semi-high-profile conversions to Christianity, and also a kind of general recovery of interest in the idea that religion is good for society, right? That the age of the new atheists has passed, and even if people are still agnostic or atheistic personally, there's much more of a sense that, actually just getting rid of organized religion did not in fact make the world a happier, less polarized, more enlightened and rational place. Quite the contrary, right? So there's that sentiment in the air as well. And I guess something that I think our arguments have in common is that I think that sentiment can be a place where sort of intellectuals especially kind of get stuck right? It's like, okay, religion isn't bad. Religion is good. It's nice that people are religious, not me personally, but other people, right, out there making nice religious art and, participating in Tocquevillian forms of community and so on, right? And there are sort of liberal and conservative versions of this kind of, pleasant belief in belief itself. But always with the sense that, of course, to fundamentally be religious is to leave rationality behind to some degree. Like, wouldn't it be nice to think so? But to think so, you have to take this kind of wild leap into the mystical dark. And so the argument that I make in my own book is that that attitude is mistaken, and also that it needs to be confronted in a way that's kind of almost like something sort of a foundation that is useful to be laid before you get to arguments about why everyone should be Christian or Roman Catholic or a particular kind of Roman Catholic. Anyway, so in a way, I was saying to someone outside, it's the moment where St. Paul is speaking to a pagan audience and says, "Look, I'm here to tell you about God's revelation, but even before you had this revelation, there are certain things that you should have known," and that idea has definitely fallen out of fashion. But I think the arguments we're talking about here tonight are in that zone. We're saying, okay, here are things that even people who are, not yet a religious believer, not yet a Christian, should take seriously as evidence impelling them toward religious considerations. So, I don't know.
Isn't that, and I want to hear from Spencer, isn't and this goes directly to Spencer's book, because he opens with this kind of movement from darkness to light, and that the real context for both of your books is actually not the kind of Christian revivalism that you might see related to the Trump phenomenon, but is actually more the death of the new atheists.
I would certainly say that's true in my case. When I set out,
you personally, killed one of them, Brian, was like an anchor man. You had his
the moment they're coming for me. This is all a setup. That's at long last I've been discovered. I never knew it would be Douthat. No, when I set out to write this book on the Lamb, from running from the law, I think I would have, if you'd asked me what are you writing about, I would have said this is a book about what is materialism and why is it wrong. And now, reflecting on the moment into which the book has emerged and kind of viewing it in the context of a number of other books that have come out or will come out, including Ross's, I would describe my book instead as what was materialism and why was it wrong. I think the impulse to fixate on the material dimension of our experience is kind of perennial, and one of the things I argue in the book is that it predates Aristotle and is in some sense the problem that Aristotle is grappling with when he launches his physics. But there's a difference between a view existing as a minority view and prevailing, on the other hand, as a kind of cultural assumption or even an atmosphere in which everybody moves. I think of the old joke about the fish who are swimming, young fish swimming along, and they pass an old fish, and the old fish says, "How's the water, boys?" And one young fish turns to the other and says, "What's water?" And I think materialism was our water. Certainly when I was growing up, I would say I came up in the high noon of the new atheism. My buddies and I in high school were kind of Reddit bros shortly before there was Reddit, and we would certainly fit that description. And for us, it was kind of a given.
Did you own a fedora?
I can neither confirm nor deny. I'm not prepared to incriminate myself any further on this stage than I already have. But I had a goatee, which basically counts. And we, I think, accepted it as read that the sum and summit of reality was to be known through the equations and facts we learned in physics class, and that any kind of spiritualism we engaged in was a sort of a tolerated holiday from reason. And to imagine that seemingly pervasive and ironclad kind of bedrock set of assumptions would be overturned in my lifetime is sort of shocking. But in fact, I think we've reached a point where the arguments in favor of materialism advanced by the new atheists and some of their coterie have truly and plainly exhausted themselves. And this is actually one of the things I really appreciate, Ross, about your book, is that you sort of begin by dispensing with those arguments at such a common sense and plain spoken level that we can sort of see, in fact, despite ream after ream of argument being made in defense of reductionism, of kind of transmuting the soul into neurobiology, each one fails at a very kind of first principles basic level. At one point, I think you say something to the effect of, whether you read a page of reductionist neurobiology or entire volumes, basic questions begin to occur to you. And that is, I think, kind of where we now are. And so my book is first and foremost a history of how it is that I think really beginning in the wake of the Newtonian revolution, not with Newton himself, but just after. And we can, I'm very pleased to report, mostly blame the French. It was Pierre-Simon Laplace and Voltaire and other inheritors of Newtonianism who really grabbed it and ran with it to totally unwarranted conclusions about the nature of reality, to the point that Voltaire is said to have dispensed with the God hypothesis when quizzed on the subject by Napoleon. That's the first part of the book. The second part is about how science itself has effectively undermined that worldview. Not Newtonianism as a useful system, not even the true principles of the scientific method, but simply the kind of porting or the transmutation of the scientific method into our fundamental epistemology. And so that intellectually, I just feel has exhausted itself. And there's also, as Ross was alluding to, I recently saw on Existential Comics, which is one of my favorite weird little web comics, on Substack, the author put out this quote, well, with the dawn of modernity, we finally had the bursting forth of reason and the end of superstition to usher in all human tolerance. And then someone else says, what happened next? The guy says, genocide, mostly. And that is sort of, it was already wildly irresponsible in the 60s for John Lennon to imagine that no religion would mean living life in peace. And now I just don't think that's a tenable point of view. And so at that point, you're sort of left with a new question that I don't think we've had to face until very recently, which is, well, okay, what next? Which is one reason why I appreciate that Ross's book is titled in the imperative mood, because we've had a lot of books telling us what went wrong. We've not had a lot of really convincing arguments about what we should do next. And so whereas Ross is sort of getting, I think, really practical directives, correct me if I'm wrong, about what to do in the wake of this collapse, I am offering what I hope is a plausible articulation of actual science at a layman's level, that nevertheless declares the glory of God. Because one thing we definitely agree on is that certain beliefs, assumptions, were overturned by, for instance, the Copernican revolution, and then again by relativity and quantum. And each time there was a kind of readjustment that had to take place, but the advertisement that was made on behalf of those readjustments was so vastly beyond the actual scope of what was being reconsidered that it pays at this juncture to kind of perform a hard reset, look afresh at what in fact has happened to us as a civilization, or is even a globe, as a species, over the past several hundred years, and ask whether the book of Genesis might not be actually one of the best tools available to us for interpreting quantum superposition. I think that is now a serious question that I ask in the book, and sort of suggest an answer in the affirmative, which would have gotten you laughed to scorn a while ago, not too long ago. And now I actually don't think that's absurd. And given the state of mind that people are in, as we're discussing, I don't think that even the most committed atheist is as confident in laughing people like us to scorn as he once was. So small victories.
I mean, you can read the comments on some of my New York Times columns and find at least some laughing to scorn.
Intelligent atheist.
These are my readers. These are wonderful people.
Yeah, and you have my sympathy.
They have.
Well, I want to ask about the definitions of religion in both of your books, because, you talk about your imperative is to become more religious. And Laplace saying, I have no need of that hypothesis. Ratzinger says about that takes a lot more faith to say, I have no need of that hypothesis.
Charles Krauthammer said something similar despite himself being kind of agnostic.
It takes a lot more faith, which is to say that Ratzinger's point there is that kind of materialism is itself a secular faith. Emil Durkheim, in Forms of Elementary Religious Life, says that the goal is actually to create faith without God. So in the materialism as a religion, I wonder if you would comment on that. And then also for you, Ross, the question is more religious or just we are religious, and the question is, which religious will we be?
Sure. I mean, do you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I mean, so I think both there's two ways of looking at it that can both be true, right? So there is one sense in which, as Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody, and everybody does, right?
Great philosopher of religion.
That noted poet and philosopher of religion,
Nobel Prize winner.
And there is a way in which everyone has a religious worldview, and materialism is a particular kind of worldview about the cosmos that shapes people's decisions, appetites, loves, goals, and so on in a way that is, somewhat similar to how Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy or Hinduism or anything else shapes people's goals. At the same time, that's sort of a, that's kind of a pundit's argument. Like, I mean, it's an argument I've made. I wrote a whole book that started with the Bob Dylan quote about sort of how people are Christian heretics often without even realizing, right? So I think that's true. I'm not trying to denigrate it by associating it with punditry, my own profession. But I also think there is a kind of, there's still a kind of commonsensical way in which a practicing member of a major world religion is religious in a way that a typical non-believer is not. They are doing something consciously and concretely that is different from how the average materialist approaches his or her existence. And I think that is especially true as you move away from attempts to sort of consciously build atheistic systems that are rivals to religion, right? So the Marxist atheist is doing something that's more religious than Richard Dawkins, because the Marxist atheist has this kind of world system, right? And this view of, frankly, a kind of predestination where, the revolution is going to win. We won't call it providence, we'll call it the iron laws of history or whatever, but this will bring about the eschaton and so on. And the new atheists
never immanentize the eschaton. That's
right.
Big rule.
Well, we're going to do it later, but we're going to do it. It's going to be big. We're going to immanentize. Sorry, I'm sorry.
He's so imminent.
We're going to immanentize the eschaton. Sorry. And so, yeah, I mean, so by the time you get to the new atheists, there's some version of that. There's still, if you read God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, he's still sort of drinking some heady drafts from the French Revolutionary spirit. There's something in there, but I do think it's sort of sub-religious in some ways. And I also think to our own moment, the non-metaphysical religions also burn themselves out very quickly, right? So we've just lived through what gets called the Great Awakening, right? Which is, religious language describe a political movement that, to your point, had religious characteristics in various ways. And there was a point sort of at the peak of the awakening when you had people writing about how, this was going to be like when the Christians took over Rome, right? Like this was it. It was, wokeness was going to be the new religious paradigm for generation. And it felt, look, trust me, I know how it felt, right? But even at that peak, my sense was, look, this is a thin post-Protestant sort of, so thin, no metaphysics, thin moralism. Like, isn't it probably going to burn itself out faster? And we'll see where we are in 10 years. These things move in cycles, but I think right now it does not look like woke progressivism is going to be the dominant religious movement in the West for the next 100 years. I would not make that bet at all. So I do think that the subtitle of my book and sort of the argument I'm making is saying, look, there are religions and then there are religions, right? And everyone has a small r religion, maybe, but the big R religions that people recognize as being different in their orientation and demands are more what you should be. You should go from being small R religious to big R religious, maybe, is sort of a way of framing that bridges the two definitions.
In a sense, the sociological distinction between functional and substantive religion, right, is helpful here. That you're actually more religious is substantive religion and I would assume you would say monotheistic.
Well, so this is part of the sort of interesting structure that I'm doing in the book. The book is sort of trying to present different ways of looking at the religious data. And yes, if you asked me what kind of religion should you be, I would say you should be a monotheist. I would say you should be a Trinitarian Christian. I would say you should be a Roman Catholic, right? But I also think that someone who is coming to I think there's a bunch of people now in the world who are interested in religion, who are just coming to the category completely afresh, right? They didn't go to Sunday school. They were raised to think, as they were raised with sort of a Reddit bro conception of what the universe was, right? They haven't had a personal mystical encounter and so on. They haven't gotten whatever divine guidance they need. And I think there's value in sort of trying to see what the landscape looks like from that perspective. And in that perspective, I think monotheism has the strongest argument, but there's a better argument for being a polytheist than for being an agnostic, right? And that's, maybe that's a weird argument for a Catholic to make. I'm not sure that the thought experiments I'm playing with are themselves experimental and possibly wrong-headed at times.
In this sense, Ross, this is a Harvard argument, right? This is William James, who prescinds from the doctrinal claims, right? And does a varieties of religious experience as to why it is reasonable to hold religious, mystical, spiritual views. Is that fair to say that you are in the William James tradition with this book?
I think so. Yeah, I think that there is a pure William James chapter in the book, and generally, I think that religious experience is an underrated zone of evidence for meaning, purpose, and some kind of divinity in the cosmos, especially underrated in the kinds of arguments that, again, people in our profession tend to engage in. But I do also think that if you just look at the raw data of spiritual experience, it does show up in a lot of different religions and a lot of different places, right? And so you need some other datum or conception to decide, besides what James is doing, to decide on which religion to actually join. But if you're just starting out and saying to the secular person, what are the reasons why you should take religion seriously? The fact that, even under, maybe especially under disenchanted conditions, these kind of experiences persist, but also fall on, the just and unjust alike, the secular and religious alike. It's a constitutive part of human existence religious and mystical experience. And that's, I think, an important sort of, again, starting place for a discussion of what should you actually believe about the universe.
It reminds me a bit of, I think it's in Surprised by Joy when C.S. Lewis is talking about what Wordsworth meant to him when he was emerging out of atheism. And he finds in Wordsworth, rightly or wrongly, a kind of pantheism, a sort of naturist religion.
Right.
And he says this wasn't an appropriate resting place. It wouldn't have been right for me to just stop there. But for the man coming up from below, it was everything. And to some of what you're saying is sort of similar. I often actually feel this way when people talk to me about figures like Jordan Peterson and say, why hasn't Peterson converted yet? And why is he in this kind of, sort of like the way station, unclear, but something like the way station you're describing. And part of me thinks it may be that up until the appropriate time, there is a role for that kind of figure that ushers people, the next step along the journey. On the subject of faiths that aren't faith, or the kind of primary religion that you contrasted, Ross, to secondary religion, I really want to write a book someday, maybe my next book, that will be called, it'll be a book about Christian heresies, and it'll be called We've Been Over This. And I think that, Tom Holland's Dominion is in some sense that book. It's the story of how almost every, if not every, supposedly secular movement in the modern West actually boils down to one among a countable number of Christian heresies. And it certainly seemed true to me as I worked on this kind of history of religion that makes up the bulk of, of science that makes up the bulk of my book, is, once you really get to hardcore atomism of the Laplace variety, one of the things that becomes very clear and is often made explicit by some of the partisans in the debate is that this is actually a revival of Epicureanism. Really what's happening is the West is kind of shifting its foot over from what has been its long-standing preference for Stoicism and the kind of quasi-monotheistic, logos rules all sort of default perspective, over to what was at the time a kind of daring and niche minority view, which is all things are made of atoms hurtling through a void, there are multiple worlds, and given this kind of cosmic insignificance therapy, what you need to do is just laugh it all off and seek, euthymia. And that suddenly, all of the hallmarks of that point of view start to emerge as atomism comes back into favor. But one of the things that doesn't really register in the modern version of Epicureanism is something that Epicurus himself makes explicit, which is you have to take atoms on faith. He says this at one point. He says, look, everything that we know through our sense data. This is one of the things. He's a hard empiricist. However, it wouldn't even be conceivably possible to look at or touch an atom, because it would basically move past the spaces between the atoms in your eye, essentially. So we can't even imagine having a direct experience of an atom. We must simply know it by its effects, and we must interpret the data to conclude what he thought was the only logical conclusion, which is that there are these little tiny ping pong balls bouncing around with electricity maybe floating, sort of zapping in between them. One of the difficult things that people discovered round about the turn of the 20th century is that they were still taking atoms on faith. In fact, this was a construct of the mind that was being imposed usefully onto the data, but didn't actually describe everything about the entities that they were talking about. So I kind of go on this tangent just to say that absolutely materialism is a kind of faith, and as Ross has kind of ably illustrated, it also gives rise, especially in the absence of traditional religion, it gives rise to all sorts of religion-shaped things that also have the quality of many of the old pagan kind of rituals. I'm thinking especially here of earth worship, which we haven't quite mentioned yet, but which has come back in a really big way. And, by the time you get to AI maximalists, you're also in the realm of Les Knight, who says we're a bad species because of what we've done to the planet, and we should just nope out of existing and kind of like yeet ourselves into the cosmos. And once those are the options on the table, it's no longer a dispute between kind of reason on and atheism on one hand and faith and superstition on the other, it's really a question of like, what are you going to do with all this spiritual energy, if you want to say it that way? How are you going to channel it? And as people are becoming aware that this is like a spiritual moment or a religious, quasi-religious moment, it's a little bit as if we had just discovered the material world, and instead of referring to a physics textbook to figure out what people had like learned about this up to this point, we instead just sort of tried to work it out as best we could, each of us individually on our own. You know, if I went out and was like, look, there's that thing in the sky, I wonder what that's, I guess it's called Saturn. Like, maybe I try to figure out what I can figure out about it. I would probably get about as far as like Empedocles' four elements. And I think that's kind of the condition that a lot of these people are in spiritually, is like, wow, the spiritual realm exists. And the obvious thing to do would be to turn to a physics textbook, the equivalent of which is the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita, or most importantly, the Bible, right? The Bible is the best physics textbook in this domain ever written. But instead, you get basically a bunch of sort of primitive and recognizable forms of quasi-faith, which, you know, a historian can kind of identify pretty easily, pick out of a lineup.
Can I ask a question about pre-Socratic materialists for a minute?
Oh, please. I was hoping you would.
Everyone's always hoping I'll talk about the
I
pre-Socratics.
know, just sitting here waiting.
Some pre-Socratics look for divine intelligence in the elements. Why didn't that happen? Or maybe you're doing that. Why didn't that happen within the materialist revolution, the modern materialism?
Well, I think depending on how loosely you want to cast your net, there are people who are attempting to find what you would call like speaking of immanentizing things, like an immanent property of mind in the material world. This is one way of, if you don't want to plunk for multiverse theory because it's just too kooky, you can sort of posit that consciousness is not a unique attribute of ensouled entities, but rather some sort of structural feature of like the material world. And I would say that's maybe the closest thing in the modern day to what you're describing, like Maximin.
And then just a follow-up question to that, and then we can come back to you, is the thing that kind of broke the materialism was the first academy. Socrates,
Yeah.
Plato, Aristotle. Is there a breakthrough for us on the horizon? Are you our Socrates?
I hope not. I know what happened to that guy.
You're right here.
Yeah, I'm getting hot under the collar. No, I'm not. But I mean, and if I were, I would definitely also say no.
We have no hemlock anywhere.
And on the premises, no philosophers were harmed in the making of this evening. Well, you know, one of the things that makes our moment so difficult to recognize is that a lot of us grew up on a morality tale about how the Catholic Church became so hidebound and sclerotic and immobile that it was unable to recognize the truths that defied its kind of neo-Aristotelian point of view. And so when guys like Jean Buridan and Nicolas Orem and then ultimately finally Galileo come along, it's heresy because it's not what they recognize as kind of truth or something like that. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that's not a totally accurate description, but much as the woke movement spent a lot of time casting about for analogs to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century and just kind of like forgot that if, you know, you're in the room and there's no jerk in the room, like you're the jerk, right? In much the same way, I think the modern academy, like cast around for analogs to the evil Catholic Church and spent a lot of time pointing fingers at like, oh, the evangelicals won't let, you know, Darwinism loose, or these people, and they don't quite realize that like they're the Catholic Church in that morality tale. Like the modern dogmatism of atheism is just as hidebound as it wants to make medieval Catholicism out to be. And so the question is like, who is going to puncture that kind of carapace of intellectual assumption? I think like Ross mentioned a couple people who have made that foray. You know, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is certainly one. That you're starting to see people in high positions of intellectual prominence defy what was previously a kind of groupthink. So it might not be one figure so much as it's like a
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I have a lot of profound uncertainty about where the 21st century is going at the moment. And I think you could tell a story where, yeah, what you are looking for are sort of people who are sort of bridgers between science, philosophy, and religion, who have more credibility than, let's be honest, either of us do. You know, we're both, Spencer in a more sophisticated way, me in a more bumptious way, trying to explicate the implications of certain scientific patterns and discoveries. But neither of us are credentialed, guild-certified scientists, right? So it would be helpful if you had sort of, you know, a cross between Stephen Hawking and David Bentley Hart, right? Who sort of was a kind of leader for what I think is the correct interpretation of the data, right? And you've had people, I think part of it though is you have people who want to go where the data is pointing them, but don't want to go to religion, right? So, you know, you'll get, I mean, you mentioned, you know, panpsychism, right? As is it Philip Goff, right? There's a guy named Philip Goff who is sort of he's written a couple of books basically saying, you know, here's why naturalism is wrong, but I'm not religious. I think mind is a fundamental constitutive part of the world. And then he keeps like almost talking himself into a heretical form of Christianity on the internet. It's fascinating. There's all these people like talking themselves. I mean, this is to your point, right? About like people who are like, you know, oh, wait, I'm going to work through these 50 arguments for the existence of God. Oh, I guess I believe in God. Oh, interesting. How did that happen, right? So there's, but, you know, or the philosopher Thomas Nagel, right, wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos that was also sort of, right, panpsychist in the end. Like, he's like, I'm not religious, but the materialists are clearly wrong, right? And that book, while I think completely correct, was also savaged by the academic guild. So that, but so that's thinking about it in intellectual terms, right? Like, okay, what do you need to get an intellectual revolution? But then there is also just all this weird action in sort of, you know, popular religiosity, but also these kind of para-religious zones that I mentioned earlier related to, you know, sort of psychedelic exploration. There's a weird current of cultishness around and through the entire AI thing. Like, I mean, look,
here's God.
Right. Here's we are, you know, in a situation, right, where some of the leading wealthy people in America, some of whom were, you know, in the Oval Office with President Donald Trump, who wants to bring God back, right, recently talking about, you know, in deep partnerships with the United States government, building, you know, the most powerful artificial intelligence the world has ever seen. And if you read their personal writings from 5 or 10 years ago, you can, you know, go read what Sam Altman of OpenAI had to say about the merge, right? You know, mind and machine, singularity, and so on. Like, these are not, you know, it's not like one Ray Kurzweil style sort of guy who's writing about this stuff. Like, this is a prevailing, not the prevailing vision, but one of the prevailing visions in the most powerful industrial center in, you know, the world right now. That's interesting. Maybe that's more important and is going to have more important effects on how we think about these issues than the arguments that we might have about religion and philosophy and science on Substack. I'm just not sure. Like, we are trying to, I mean, we are engaged as a civilization, you might say, in a project of summoning at the moment. I think it's one way of thinking about what we're doing. And, you know, I want a robot butler too, right? Like, part of me thinks, you know, we know consciousness is not reducible in the way that these people think it is. Therefore, they will just create some robot butlers while imagining themselves bringing in the singularity, and that'll be great. And part of me reads That Hideous Strength and freaks out, right? And like, I, you know, as a newspaper columnist, I operate between those two paradigms. But it's a very, I'd say it's we should be uncertain both about the kind of intellectual question of, what is the state of the debate? What are the institutional forces? What are the paradigm shifts? And also uncertain about the things that we as a society are actually doing that have religious implications.
I want to ask, without giving any spoilers to these great books, but you both end with Christianity, right? You both end you with kind of a stark choice in the end, right? And it's a kind of choice about the biblical world, or a sort of Babylonian Marduk kind of dark, sinister view of creation versus a lighter view of creation that is in concord with God. And you end not with a William James type conclusion, right? You end with thinking about your account of belief as informing your Christian faith. Could you both kind of speak to that?
Sure. Well, I do ultimately, I cannot tell a lie, think that the choice between the book of Genesis and the Enuma Elish is sort of the only choice.
That's the fundamental.
That's always the fundamental choice. And I don't think that you, after making the book of Genesis choice, are then destined to become, a Roman Catholic or an Episcopalian or what have you. But it seems that one reason why the book of Genesis is a shocking work of revisionist history is because it stands out like a bright lone star against an otherwise kind of universal backdrop. It's the one account that we have from antiquity that begins unambiguously with mind and language at the heart of the cosmos, and then invites kind of tohu vabohu, invites uncertainty and chaos and potential so that there can be creation. Every other story that I can think of, the Marduk legend, the Ashur legend, the stuff we have from Ugarit, the Hesiod's Theogony, a text, that I've loved since I was but a lad, they all start with chaos. When the heavens above were not yet named, when it was nameless and void, Apsu and Tiamat wrestled in the deep. And the natural consequence of that theology is that some God has to impose his name, make a name for himself by brute force, and the ultimate kind of human implication for that, I believe, is the Tower of Babel. And that might be like a longer story, but I think it explains in part why so many of these kind of Altman type AI projects have a distinctively Babelian character to them, and that is, of course, where Lewis gets the title for that hideous strength, is from a poem about the shadow cast by the Tower of Babel. So I think clearly that the line between, the alternate kind of backdrop view of creation that the Bible is competing with, the line between that other Enuma Elish view and Babel and our present day is, to me, like a bright straight line. And the only alternative to that story that I know is Bereshit bara Elohim va'et Shemayim va'et ha'aretz. Like, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So I'm actually not presenting that in the book as an act of apologetics in the traditional sense. I just genuinely think that when you get down to these really fundamental, like, what's the world made out of issues, those are the two options.
Which is Gnosticism versus realism, right?
Definitely Gnosticism represents, I think, one of the major strengths. And, if that hideous strength is about the Tower of Babel, then Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials is Gnosticism.
Right. Yeah, and I guess, right. So, and I end, right. You end at the beginning of the Bible, and I end not at the end, but at the, with the Gospels.
They're all good. They're all good.
Not the other stuff. And yeah, I mean, sort of, so in my sort of William Jamesian mode, my argument is basically that if you don't look too closely at the particular claims of the founders of the major world religions and their point of origin, if you just sort of take their general world pictures, you would say that they're all responding to somewhat similar data in terms of and the nature of the cosmos, the nature of religious experience, and so on, right? And they all in different ways present a world where there's some kind of highest power, there's some sort of intermediate powers, angels and demons, small g gods, jinn, whatever you want to call it. There are human beings. There's heaven after you die. There's hell after you die. There's disagreement between East and West about whether you get reincarnated out of that hell or stay in it. We can bring in David Bentley Hart to, and have that dispute another time.
What were you gonna, and Plato
and right. But that's sort of there are those similarities that I think reflect a common response to a common set of data. And then there's the question of, okay, well, should you take any of these stories as these world pictures as controlling? Is the word, like, is there it seems like God and the supernatural is in some way manifest in a lot of different times and places. Okay, so you can be a perennialist, right? You can just say, that's it. All the religions contain parts of the truth. They're all pretty cool, just pick one. Or you can look for a place that's sort of the most important place that provides the interpretive framework through which to understand the entire data set. And yeah, the place I end is arguing that that's what I think the Gospels and the New Testament, especially the Gospels, represent. That as, the distinctiveness that Spencer talks about with the book of Genesis, among other ancient religious texts, I think also applies to the Gospels, among other foundational texts for the big capital R religions. And this is, this then becomes a fairly conventional piece of Christian apologetics at the end of my more general account. I do think the place where I think there is some overlap between what we're talking about with sort of where science has actually gone and what I say about the Gospels is in, there's just as there's a story about how Galileo and Darwin together sort of overthrew religion and superstition. There's a story about how historical critical scholarship overthrew the credibility of the Gospels and the New Testament. And to an even greater degree than I think the first story is wrong. I think the second story is just manifestly wrong, and that Christians should have more confidence even than they sometimes do outside the more, disreputable but ultimately correct realms, maybe. In just sort of straightforwardly saying these are shockingly historically credible accounts. If you don't think they're memoirs and eyewitness testimony, then you're nuts. You don't have to believe in the resurrection, but you have to take them seriously as a crazily distinctive intervention, a spike on the graph of religious experiences and so on. So that's where I end up.
That part of the book was so gratifying to me because in grad school...
You've been afraid I was pulling you towards Hinduism.
Yeah. I never for a second, Ross, would I have suspected you of trying to Hinduize me. But no, in grad school I worked a lot on the book of Isaiah. And of course, Isaiah has been just a feasting ground for textual criticism. It's been chopped up into any number of different Isaiahs and Proto and Deutero and Trito. And I used to read this stuff and think, it's not my area exactly. I was a Greek scholar, but I just thought these are shockingly bad arguments. And I think if that's true of Old Testament scholarship, it's extra true of New Testament stuff. Guys, you have a question, Ross, about I was wondering about Ayaan Hirsi Ali in the book, who shows up as an example of somebody that takes a hard look at kind of the fruits of Christianity and then dives in. Now, it's, as you say, it's unclear whether she actually maybe, in fact, it seems to me, I would say it seems quite clear that she has then gone a step beyond that and affirmed, the metaphysical claims of Christianity. But as you say, let's imagine that kind of person that just kind of goes to church, as it were, from the outside in. What's your sort of point of view about that, and are you optimistic about the possibility that many people are having that kind of realization, and do you think that it can work that way? People kind of see the fruits and want the tree.
Yeah. So full disclosure, Ayan Hirsi Ali and I are supposed to be debating partners at an event in Austin, Texas, sponsored by Barry Weiss's The Free Press, where we will be debating Michael Shermer and Adam Carolla on the questions of God. So that's at the end of February, if the world lasts that long, and so that anything that I say about her is colored obviously by the fact that we will be debating together. But I am. So the Hirsi Ali conversion was interesting because it provoked. So she wrote an essay, I think, for Unheard, about her conversion that was very heavy on sort of ideas about, being a defender of Western civilization and small L liberal values, and feeling over time that those values just didn't have a foundation without religion and religious belief and so on. So it was heavy on that, and it was not heavy on the New Testament and Jesus and so on, right? And so that prompted a lot of criticism from some Christians, some of her former fellow atheists and so on, saying, well, this is just this kind of, this is like converting to save Western civilization kind of thing. And there's been a lot of, I was actually trying to write something about this for the Free Press as part of my, so maybe you'll read this argument in longer form if they decide to run it. But there's a lot of anxiety about whether people are converting for the right reasons. I think it's sort of part of this weird, not quite a religious revival moment that we're in. And generally my view is that, one, I think in subsequent pieces and interviews, it's clear that Hirsi Ali's own conversion is not just I'm converting for Western civilization, that it's more that was sort of the thing that first pulled her toward religion. But I'm generally very pro-conversion. I just want to put that on the record. And, people convert for all kinds of reasons, right? And people convert, and it can be embarrassing, right? I'll be honest, if I watch a video where Russell Brand is talking about Christianity, I cringe. I'm not, I liked Get Him to the Greek, but Russell Brand is a guy who, was a celebrity. He was basically an atheist and on the man of the left, and then he got, he was accused of rape and sexual assault, and suddenly he converted to Christianity, and a lot of people are like, oh, and became anti-woke, and everyone's like, very convenient, Russell Brand, and so on, right? But you know what? He converted to Christianity. He was baptized. He did it. And whatever his motivations, whatever his, what is his true motivation? I don't know. What are my true motivations, right? I think, I think in the book, I try and give people sort of, here are different things you can do. You want to be religious? Here are different things you can do. Read these kind of arguments. Decide what kind of religious experience you want. Do you want a supernatural experience? Do you want an ethical vision and so on? Read the New Testament and the Bhagavad Gita together. See what you think. There's a lot of ways into religion. Sometimes the way into religion, though, is just who are my friends? Who are my attractive religious friends? I love Western civilization. Western civilization was Christian, right? That's not a bad place to start. It doesn't mean it doesn't tell you anything about necessarily where you're going to end up. But my basic vision, with, respectfully to him, is I am pro Hirsi Ali and anti Jordan Peterson, right? I have this deep allergic reaction to the whole, let's have a long talk about the deep Jungian symbolism of the gospel texts. And I'm like, all right, yeah, sure. But did they happen? Did it happen? Let's talk about that, right? And look, everyone is on a journey, right? Jordan Peterson's wife, I think, was
yeah.
I don't want to speak about anyone's sort of private journey. I just think the public presentation of, I prefer the public presentation of, I'm not sure in any way about Christianity, but I am converting and trying to be a Christian. I vastly prefer that to this, we who wrestle with God and just wrestle and wrestle and wrestle.
Struggle session with
the take. Well, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's in Brideshead Revisited when one of the big characters comes back to Christianity. They quote Chesterton's Father Brown novels. He caught him with the unseen hook and the invisible line. It's a very, very long line that stretches from Western civilization back to Christianity, and a lot of people do get caught in it. That's interesting. Certainly, like the opposite extreme from the Hirsi Ali situation would be, I guess, the Dawkins cultural Christianity situation, right?
Right. I mean, that's look. I mean, the people who I really have contempt for that. It's like, oh man, God doesn't exist, but oh, these Muslims are going to take away my choirs and empty Anglican cathedrals. Shut up. Just spare me. I know that. Like, whatever critique I have of Jordan Peterson, I will take Jordan Peterson 1,000 times over Richard Dawkins. It's like I've tried to tear down my inheritance and salt the ground, and now I'm mad that there are so many Muslims.
Wait.
Like,
nobody could possibly have predicted this.
So, I mean, I'm sorry, but, the Muslims are correct about fundamental questions about the universe, and Richard Dawkins is fundamentally wrong, so they deserve to inherit his atheistic Oxford.
I mean, Michelle Houellebecq's been writing this novel over and over again for
There's another one of these guys, though. It's like, oh, yes, it's difficult.
Certainly,
In the 19th century, one could do the au revoir, mais maintenant I am stuck here, ever.
We
just
prefer
go to
the Christmas carols to beheadings.
Sorry, this is what happens when I'm not the moderator. When I'm the moderator, it's very, I'm very.
It's my fault. I'm more asked you a question. I stepped in. I grabbed the microphone.
when we can have clips about who you hate.
I don't.
Go
I
viral.
don't hate. I don't. I. Richard Dawkins is actually a brilliant writer, and I just want to say he's a really, really good writer.
Bless
and
his heart.
And he's just going. It's important to say something nice about someone made in the image of God. That's all.
What do you guys think? Should we? All these people.
They should ask some questions.
They should ask some questions. So I think we have just about 23 or 4 minutes to ask some questions. I think there's somebody with a mic. Is that right? I'm sorry, the lights are, I can't see where you are. Okay, so there's people here, and I'm going to call on people, and so I'll try to pick people near you. Right up front here. And I just remind everybody to be clear, succinct, and to ask a question on topic. If you don't, we'll skip to the next person.
But if you want to do a Michel Houellebecq French accent, it will be accepted.
Encouraged.
Encouraged.
No.
Shutting it down.
Moderator.
Well, I won't do that, but I do have somewhat French related. But I found it interesting when you mentioned the change from people who are atheists, then they go to sort of the vague, I believe in God, but I don't really know, then to Christianity, because that was sort of like what the French philosophers believe of natural philosophy. And at the time, all the Christians said, well, that's a stupid thing because it's just going to lead to atheism, which is exactly what happened. And I just think it's interesting now it's sort of reversing. Sort of shows, one, the shallowness of the whole natural religion thing, but also just sort of, I don't know, I found that interesting. And also, after the revolution, you talked about the philosophies and their influence on us now, but there was a somewhat of a religious revival with like Chateaubriand and Lamartine, and obviously, they wrote the genius of Christianity or atheism among the people. And I just sort of wanted, like, obviously, reprinting 200-year-old books isn't going to convert the rest of the world, but do you think like those are also people we should look to in sort of understanding this religious revival?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was painting with a very broad brush and being flippant when I said we can blame the French as a whole for this. Of course, that's not entirely true.
Some of them, I'm sure, are nice people.
I've heard. I believe it. Never seen one, empirical evidence. No, but to your first point, I think one thing that shows is perhaps not just the shallowness of natural religion, but also the instability of it. That it's not a resting place, and people don't rest there. And so the real question is, from which direction are you coming to natural religion? Are you coming to it on a sort of, as I would characterize it, a downward trajectory from some more kind of Ross Douthat style secondary faith? Or are you coming, as Lewis said, up from below? And then to your second question, whether we should be revisiting some of the defenses of Christianity and monotheism more generally that were made in that era, absolutely. I mean, that's a major kind of strain in my book, is that some of the thinkers who seemed sort of obscure or strange at the time were actually some of the most prescient about whither materialism was portending. And I'm thinking here especially of Bishop Barclay, a philosopher against whom I reacted violently in college because he has this, I think, overstated case that all is, like, everything's in our heads, basically. But, you know, much like David Hume, you can't read Barclay until you understand that he's reacting to a new idea called matter. He's trying to, like, identify the problems with this new conception of matter that have emerged. And so, yeah, I think, like, in the light of that larger historical sweep, previously neglected books actually do become suddenly much more relevant and interesting.
Right here, in the front.
Well, thank you, all of you. So my question is that even though I want every single person on the planet to convert and to be a Catholic, because I believe and I know it is a truth, I still do worry that some conversions are just using Catholicism and Christianity overall as a mask to push for certain type of reactionary politics, which I'm worried about, and I don't know if you both are. I think of this very high-profile Candace Owens, who minutes after becoming Catholic started denying facts about the Holocaust and went full anti-Semite. That's some sort of conversion that I don't know if it is truth or not. I couldn't know, but I'm still worried about. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I guess, so for those who couldn't hear, he referenced Candace Owens, the prominent podcaster. We're all prominent podcasters, but who converted to Catholicism during what I would say has been her sort of descent towards conspiracy theorizing and all kinds of conspiracy theorizing. I guess I'm, just to sort of continue my kind of maximalist defense, right? Like, is there any evidence that what is true is that there are particular subcultures within Catholicism that are prone to certain kinds of pathologies. And so there are people who convert to Catholicism via or into those subcultures who take on those pathologies. And that's a bad thing. At the same time, like, there's no, like, is there, I don't, it doesn't seem to me that the Catholic conversion was sort of instrumental in that particular descent, right? Like, first of all, it's not as if there's a shortage of cradle Catholics who end up holding, toxic ideas, right? Like, there's a billion Catholics in the world. There's a lot of Catholics who have toxic ideas who didn't have to go through any conversion process to get there, right? They just adopted toxic ideas. And there's a lot of people who adopt toxic ideas without having any kind of conversion involved. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say, like, she expressed a desire to join the Catholic Church. She presumably, I assume she didn't need to be baptized, but she went to confession and was shriven and said what she was supposed to say and participated in the sacraments and so on. I'm just hesitant as a believer in the efficacy of those sacraments to say that was a bad thing and she shouldn't have done it, right? Like, but this also relates to my general sort of, the parts of my book where I'm being maybe dubiously ecumenical and talking about, Islam and polytheism and so on. Like, if you stipulate that God is real and providence exists, then people taking steps toward God is good, even when it doesn't work out the way that we want it to work out. And we also just don't know also like what is the time horizon of some of these things, right? Like what does Candace Owens' life look like in 25 years? What role does her Catholic conversion play? I think one should just be very hesitant about saying we know and it was a mistake. I don't know.
Yeah, and certainly the sacraments that you're describing that were the essence of her conversion are not inextricable from the subsequent decomposition, descent that you're describing. We know they're not, because all sorts of Catholics all over the world, people convert to Catholicism, people are raised Catholic without then indulging in kind of wild and grotesque conspiracy theories. And so the question is really, as Lewis, I think, said at one point, the question is not, what happens to a person after they convert, and does it look to us like, a total moral cleansing and the perfect life that we would ideally want for them. Rather, the question is, what would have happened to that person without Christianity? And we can never answer that question, just as we can never speak ultimately to the state of anybody's soul. But I think, Ross it sounds like you would argue, and I would agree, that, the Catholicism, there's no reasonable way to look at what happened to Candace Owens and say, oh, Catholicism was the problem, so we should really pull back from Catholicism. Like that's
well, and I don't think, that's not what the questioner is saying. I think the question is more like, are there situations where again, we're sticking with Catholicism, but this could apply to other forms of Christianity, to someone reverting to Judaism as well, right? But is there a situation where someone who is responsible for that conversion should sort of say like, no, right, don't do this, right? Because it's bound up in you becoming a flat Earth anti-Semite conspiracy theorist or something. And
well, flat Earth. I mean, come on.
Well,
it's a matter of perspective.
Have you been? Yeah, you got to go to the polls and see and there.
Sure, you're telling me
I guess I really think you should say no if you think someone is lying, right? If you think someone is pretending to doing it under false pretenses, like they're a communist agent in 1960s Poland and they want to become a Catholic bishop for the sake of Marxist-Leninism to destroy the church, okay, yeah, then you should say no. But if somebody says, hey, I sincerely believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and this is the one true church and the sacraments are valid and I want to come in, you should try to counsel them away from toxic ideas that they may be adopting as part of the conversion. But I just think it's hard for a church or a religion that takes itself seriously to say, no, this is bad. And then also, that's an extreme example, right? But you'll have people, say like, oh, all these right-wing politicians, or there are right-wing politicians, especially in Europe, who sort of will play a kind of cultural Catholic card, right? Where they're like, I'm not practicing, sort of almost Dawkins-esque, right? Not as bad maybe, but like we are cultural Catholics here in Italy, even though I don't go to church. And so we, that's bad, but that's not about whether they're converting or not, right? It would be better, all things being equal, for that politician to go back to church, even if they were saying the same thing. It just would be, again, if you think that God is present in the church. It's hard for me to see circumstances where taking a step toward God can be judged as like the wrong course that shouldn't have been done.
Which really is how you conclude your book. Really is that nudge towards God is the thing that we want. The problem's old, though. This is, if we're on the verge of some revival and you get lots of conversions. St. Augustine dealt with this in the conversion of the Roman Empire. You have Constantine and Theodosius, power aligns with the church, and guess what? Christianity booms when power aligns with the church. And you had this class of person that Augustine called the middling Christian, who didn't actually match up perfectly. And Augustine wrote, that's okay, because in the net scheme, God wins.
I think the challenge is more, what do you do with Constantine when he's like murdering his relatives, right? I mean, I think the middling, I think, yeah, definitely the middling Christian.
Or Theodosius.
Or Theodosius.
7,000.
Right, exactly. It's like the challenge is sharpest at the point of power itself, not the people who are sort of brought along, which has some relevance for.
Then you do what Dante did, and you get back at everybody. You don't.
Right, you write. That's right. That's right. You write some excellent
Poetry that separates the sheep from the goats.
I see a hand up in the back here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm curious about the geographic aspect of this religious revival. Is this a trend that you're noticing mostly in America? Is it playing out in a similar way in Europe, which is generally a more secular society? Could you see this spreading to non-Western societies as well? Like, could you see this leading to a growth in Christianity in say, China or India? Thanks.
Well, I'm most familiar with the Anglosphere, so I won't be able to speak with any authority to the kind of minutia of the conditions overseas. So all I'll say, I guess, is this. I think that the situation we've been talking about here tonight seems to me to be led by the United States, and I would go one step further and say that I'm enough of a chauvinist and an exceptionalist to actually believe that where the U.S. goes, so goes the world. That may not always be true. It certainly hasn't always been true. But I do feel that despite what people in Europe will tell you, they don't just follow our news alongside theirs because it gets plastered on every newspaper. There's actually something urgent about the American project, and especially at this moment when it's clearly going through some sort of inflection point. And so from again my inexpert kind of observation, it seems like contemporary Europe is in some deep stuff. It's really in trouble. But I also think that in some ways the friends I have, especially back in the UK, are really looking to us to kind of set the tone of the coming century.
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence we have suggests that there's sort of a bottoming out that happens of the prior religious dispensation, and places in Europe where it has clearly happened, where in fact it happened before it happened in America, seem to have maybe slightly more stirrings. I mentioned that data on Gen Z in the UK. I think there's, some younger Catholic stirrings in France and so on. In places like Poland and Eastern Europe, where the church seemed a lot stronger 20 years ago than in Western Europe, I think there's more collapse ahead. That there's sort of the sort of attempt to create bastions of the prior religious dispensation just tends to fail, and so I think you're more likely to see a youth revival in the secular UK right now than you are in the heretofore for extremely Catholic parts of Eastern Europe. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong, but that would be my sort of European guess. To say something global, I mean, the other thing along with the AI machine god that's happening right now is just this crazy collapse in global fertility. And this was another event that we did here recently, right? So, but this extends across Catholic and Protestant, East Asian, Western European countries all over the place, right? And so, in a way, you could make an argument that there's sort of a race between a potential religious revival and this kind of sort of I forget which guy you mentioned, the idea that the human race should just sort of
last night.
Right. But it's some mixture of that in this sense. Maybe it's connected to AI of sort of obsolescence. It's like human beings are obsolete. There's some of that. It's the iPhone. It's a million things that we don't fully understand. But I think that's sort of an important part of this story, right? That people are interested in religion again, in part because it seems like a way through this strange bottleneck that's being created in a very literal Darwinian biological sense for the human species, where it's if you don't have some kind of metaphysical horizon, you're NGMI, you're not going to make it through.
Can I just jump the queue? What about the UFOs? People are crazy about conspiracy theories, about I guess the story of having conversations with an alien called Eve, who has introduced religion for thousands of years into human history. Like, there is an enormous appetite for that, which seems utterly crazy to me, but it's a phenomenon that's happening.
I mean, gosh, conspiracy theory. It's like, you guys are going to tell me we went to the moon next. No. And all I can say is, if you want to know about this stuff, you should buy Ross's book. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about UFOs in there, and some interesting stuff about. Sorry, no, overpromise, underdeliver. Isn't that how it goes? No, it's yeah. To me, from the outside, it has all the hallmarks of one of the quasi-proto-faiths we were discussing earlier today. I am enough of a mysticist myself to think that if you dabble around the edges of that universe, you're going to bump up against some nasty stuff. And sometimes I feel we live in a very, actively demonic age. I mean, this is my tinfoil hat, my actual conspiracy theory.
It seems diabolical.
It does to me, yeah. I mean, again, I haven't dabbled in it and don't feel confident to, but I think there's a reason why Christians from Dante to Milton to Lewis have placed kind of the higher entities, at least notionally or metaphorically, in space. There's something very suggestive about that, and it gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Same.
Yeah, I have. So one of the first conversations I did to promote this book was I recorded a podcast with Tyler Cowen, the George Mason economist and polymath, who some of you are familiar with. And Tyler, he can't be quite convinced that miracles are real without video, but there's video of UAPs, right? So he says that this has actually shaken his faith in materialism in a weird way. And if you want to listen to that podcast where he tries to get me to sort of tease out different supernatural possibilities for the UFOs, I don't know if I can keep my job if I, have too many of these conversations. But I really don't know what is going on with the UFO stuff. It is a very puzzling phenomenon that has a bunch of different components. It's not clear to me how they fit together. I think there's a lot of different scenarios in play, ranging from it's all a weird government psyop to, C.S. Lewis's space trilogy was correct, to literal extraterrestrials, to, and that too is I would not have said that 7 or 10 years ago. I was not interested in UFOs particularly. I watched the X-Files as a kid, but it was not my thing. But all of which is to say that is another example of some of the weird forces in play in our religious moment that I do not actually understand.
You guys seen that meme where it's a handle of Jack Daniels and the label is That Hideous Strength, just the cover. And when you get to the neck, down to the neck, it says, gee, this book is off to a slow start. And then the rest of it is, I am now thoroughly convinced that our scientists are talking to demons.
But it gets you, that question seems to me gets you from the more religious to the question of true versus false religious.
It's a good point. That actually, dabbling without a rule book is nasty work and liable to. I mean, again, I guess I'm just speaking entirely in memes now, but there's a tweet out there somewhere or an exceat in which somebody says, all these guys that go out and they take ayahuasca, this is the least spiritual.
Covering all the.
Is some. I'm sorry, am I incriminating you now?
No, it's just over a long enough time horizon. Any conversation I'm in that comes back to UFOs, ayahuasca. But go on.
Well, it's just, these guys that take ayahuasca, they're the least spiritually prepared people in history, and they're messing with a 6-dimensional Mesoamerican demon from antiquity. So there's definitely something,
You don't want the more religious to be bad religious, right? You don't want more bad religion. We want more true religion.
Totally. And part of the I think, subtext of our conversation has been that we may already have a lot of bad religion out there by another name. Like a hot take would be what Ross is referring to as like primary kind of natural faith or something is really just pagan. Like paganism is kind of the natural state of man. And I don't want to put those words in your mouth, but I would go that far and say, like, if you really just leave people to their own devices,
Yes.
we land somewhere.
Well,
But
I think that's right. I do think that I am to, continue my sort of ecumenical beat. I do think that there are some real convergences that you can see, not just in Christianity itself, but in Islam, but not only there, in certain schools of Hinduism and so on, right? That take you beyond that kind of that kind of like, we're just looking for the intermediate power to make a deal with, right? And I think there is, like, independent of just the specific truth of the Christian revelation, I think there was general progress in religion away from a let's make a deal just, with the local Mesoamerican six-dimensional whatever demon, right? But to your point, right, that like people are sort of thrown back to the beginning. Or no, it was right. Your line about the physics, right? People doing physics, right? With that, if you throw people back to the beginning and say, guess what? Spiritual realities are real, and we're not going to tell you anything else. They're just real. You're going to have people out there. Like, I was watching, a video, probably Rod Dreher shared it, right? Or something, and it was a guy, who's into people who are into, like, saying, oh, you can summon the UFO, right? You can talk to the UFO, right? And the guy's like, so all you got to do is just say, I'm here. Come on in. That's a bad thing to say. I want to be clear, since I am being ecumenical, right? I am ecumenical, but there are certain things that are bad things to say, and a lot of people are saying them, and, including people building the machine gods. So there you go. All right,
Well, I think this is our cue to say thank you to
Don't summon demons.
And I believe there are priests here, so if you need exorcistic prayers after there is a table over there. I'll say it again, the CIC table, 2 books for half price. So buy your books and then have some refreshments over here and we'll circulate. Thank you very much.